Good afternoon. I'm Daniel Benjamin. I'm the director of the John Sloan Dickey Center, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this year's Open Chain Family Great Issues Lecture, which will be presented by Carol Graham on, in short form, the pursuit of happiness, or in the longer form, beyond GNP, what's the new science of happiness, what it can contribute to economics and to policy. Although he couldn't be here today, I particularly want to express my gratitude to Bill Obenchain of the class of 1962, and now the chairman of the Dickey Center's Board of Visitors, and to his wife Penny for their very generous support for this event. Secretary of State George Shultz has been quoted as saying that if you want to find out what someone thinks, one very good way to go about it is to listen to them. And that, I believe, is what is at the very heart of the pioneering work that Carol Graham has done in economics. Using survey information and an array of other tools, she and her collaborators and colleagues in the growing field of happiness economics are trying to get beyond the data and beyond what economists call the revealed preferences that we find in statistics and that we are familiar with, and to move on to expressed ones. In short, they are listening to what their subjects are saying on a broad range of subjects. And this new approach takes us beyond measures focused primarily or solely on income and into a more comprehensive assessment that takes into account individuals' views of how different aspects of their lives contribute to their sense of well-being and what it is that makes them content. She's taking her findings even further and also asking what the policy implications of this approach are and what governments might or should do to help us improve our well-being and how ultimately to live a good life. Carol Graham is the Leo Paswalski Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution and College Park Professor at the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland. She's also a Research Fellow at the Institute for the Study of Labor. She is author of, I think, at least 8 books. Have I got that right? The counting, I'm not an economist for a reason. The counting became problematic, but who could resist her recently published, the title of her recently published book, The Pursuit of Happiness Toward an Economy of Well-Being, which was published by Brookings. Or the previous one, which also has a great title, Happiness Around the World, The Paradox of Happy Peasants and Miserable Millionaires, Oxford University Press, 2009, and many, many other titles and many, many other articles as well. She has been a consultant to the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the IADB. She has served as Vice President and Director of Governance Studies at Brookings, and she has many, many other impressive achievements, including degrees from Princeton and Oxford. Perhaps most impressively, she has Vermont roots and taught skiing at Stowe. And that explains a lot why she's here today when many others probably wouldn't venture into this kind of cold. She has been she has testified in Congress on a number of occasions, and she has written for just about every publication you may have come across, from the Wall Street Journal to the New Yorker, to the Wall Street Journal, Christian Science Monitor, Financial Times, and the Washington Post, and she has been reviewed in the New Yorker, which is an extraordinary thing, and many other places. She's had many different foundations support her work, and I'm pleased to say that she was one of my favorite colleagues when I was at Brookings as well. I have to confess to an ulterior motive in asking Carol to come. We've been friendly for many years, but my interest in her work was renewed when I read an Economist story a couple of years ago that was talking about the new science of happiness, and it noted that the trend in personal happiness is not exactly what you would expect, and that people's exuberant youth is actually not always so exuberant, and that in fact happiness picks up in their late 40s and early 50s. And so I asked her here today because I want to know when that's all going to kick in. So with that, I'm delighted to welcome Carol Graham.
Well, thank you, Dan, and I will, for both the very kind introduction and the invitation to be here. I must be part Vermonter if I came up to Dartmouth in January. I think we initially said I was going to ski, and of course I'm going back to work tomorrow instead. But anyway, and I will even show you some data on that age curve that should improve your happiness. Anyway, it's a pleasure to be here, and it's actually my first time ever at Dartmouth, so that's a nice thing. So how did all of this start? I started off my career as a typical development economist working on poverty and inequality in third world countries. I'm from Peru, actually, originally. I started my field research there and spent a lot of my most of my career tromping around to slums in the third world and understanding the coping strategies of the poor during different kinds of macroeconomic conditions, and also looking a lot at policy reforms at transition economies during the fall of the Berlin Wall. But I fell into some data about 15 years ago where we got these findings where we had income data on people for about 10 years, so we knew how they'd done, we knew who'd done well, who hadn't done well in Peru, and they'd done remarkably well. And this is at a time that people were throwing, fire bombs in the Seattle WTO meetings. There were protests outside the World Bank. Everybody was saying globalization is bad for the poor. I was looking at these data going, these people are leaving poverty at remarkable rates. I wonder how they think they've done. And we went back and we re-interviewed people for whom we had objective income data, and over half of the people who had done the best said their economic situation was worse than it was 10 years ago, and they also reported to be less happy than people who had no economic change at all. So I was doing this with a co-author, also Peruvian, and we thought maybe Peruvians are, first we said maybe it's the day of the survey, maybe Chile beat Peru in football that day, and that's what did it. So we did this several times in a row, and we kept getting the same findings. So we moved on. I got data from Russia, data from China, and we keep finding these frustrated achievers, people that had remarkable rates of upward mobility, moving out of poverty, who said things were very bad. So trying to explain this, I fell into what was then a very, very teeny collaboration of a couple of economists. I think we could count maybe 10 of them total, Danny Blanchflower, who's here on the faculty, being one of them, collaborating with a handful of psychologists, and all of us were seen to be outliers in our fields. What changed things a little bit is that one of them, Danny Kahneman, became the first psychologist to get the Nobel Prize in economics in 2002. But mainly what changed is that the more we worked together, the more and more other economists in particular started working with these data and publishing and getting findings that seemed to get some attention. And so what began as what was really seen to be a crazy bunch of outliers has turned into, I think, a new science of measuring well-being. And it's gone beyond anything that I ever imagined. And so today there's remarkable interest in the topic of happiness. A lot of it is in the public media. The topic happiness gets a lot of attention. But the whole science of measuring well-being is really being taken seriously in policy circles. There are any number of governments that now have well-being metrics in their statistics. The British government has, as part of its Office of National Statistics, well-being data. They have a whole office for, called the Behavioral Insights Team at 10 Downing Street, where they are using the well-being data to inform policy. The OECD has issued guidelines for countries, for statistical offices around the world. If you're going to measure well-being, these are the things we know from the science. This is how you should do it. Then there's the Jeff Sachs effect. For those of you that don't know Jeff Sachs, he's one of the most vocal economists on any number of topics in development. He's an advisor to the Secretary General of the UN, and he is trying to make happiness the 9th Millennium Development Goal. And while I don't agree that that's a good idea, I am floored by the amount of momentum that has the topic, he's achieved on the topic, and I've been working with his team in terms both agreeing and disagreeing. So we've really gone from being these crazy outliers to being in the policy discussions around the world. And most recently, we now, even in the US, which is a little bit behind everybody else in this area, we just finished a National Academy of Sciences panel report on which well-being metrics should go into the US statistical system. So even the US now is starting to think about how do we use these metrics in our statistics and what kinds of policies would we apply them to. So what I want to talk about today, which will, I think, kind of review the science a little bit, talk a lot about some development questions. I'm personally most interested in developing economies and their progress and progress paradoxes, which I'll show you, but this applies more generally. I want to focus on 3 questions. One is why the particular dimension of well-being matters. Before, when we first started, we just used happiness. That was in the surveys. We didn't know much about it. We were blunt-tooled economists until we really started working with psychologists and got a better handle on the fact that different questions measured very different parts of well-being. So now we really work much more on trying to define well-being in which dimension. And my work suggests that which dimension of well-being respondents emphasize when they answer these questions has a lot to do with how much agency or capability they have to make choices, to do what they want to do with their lives. And I will try and explain as we go through here why respondents in Afghanistan can report to have smiled more yesterday than respondents in Latin America, or to be happy in general more than the world average, but when they answer how does your life compare to the best possible life, they score very low. So there are big differences in terms of which dimension of well-being people think about or emphasize. And then the issue of adaptation. One of the things we find, and I found in my research around the world, is people are remarkably adaptable, and they can adapt to tremendous adversity, and they can also adapt to tremendous prosperity. And that obviously affects how they answer these questions. Related to that, because of adaptation, what's a meaningful change in well-being? We know what a meaningful change in the unemployment rate is. We may not really know that in terms of numbers in our head. You don't know how many, when they announce that the unemployment rate changed by a 0.5 percentage point. I don't think anybody really knows how many. That really only means about 1,000 people, actually. But I don't think that's what matters to the public understanding of that metric. It's that we know that 0.5 percentage point on the unemployment rate is a meaningful change. And we need to explain that in terms of well-being. And then lastly, something that I call changes versus levels in the process of growth and development, and why we find a lot of progress paradoxes, some of which really are short-term. But before going into those, I want to introduce you a little bit to the science of well-being and some of the basic findings around the world. One of the things we can do with these metrics is we can answer questions as diverse as the effects of commuting on well-being, why cigarette taxes make smokers happier. It sounds crazy, but they do, and I'll explain that in a minute. Why the unemployed are less unhappy when there are more unemployed people around them, and why people adapt to things like crime and corruption and bad governance. Now, if you look at those findings, every single one of those contradicts standard economics. Standard economics would say everybody is a rational actor and they reveal their preferences, and those preferences reflect the utility they get from choices that they make with their consumption or their income, right? Why is commuting time so unhappy? If you revealed your preference and you bought a big house far away from your work because you want the big house in the suburbs, and all of a sudden you're miserable 4 hours a day, what's wrong with that? How does that not, that doesn't fit with a revealed preferences rational actor framework. Why does cigarette taxes make smokers happier? That seems crazy. Well, if you think about smoking as a revealed preference, it's a perfect revealed preference, then that doesn't make sense. If you think about smoking as an addiction or self-control problem, then you think differently about it. The data is showing that smokers are less happy than non-smokers, and if you tax smokers in certain contexts, there's a well-being, a positive effect. And then standard economics would say if you're unemployed and there are more unemployed people around you, you should be very unhappy because your probability of being reemployed is obviously much lower if there are more unemployed people around you. But it turns out if there are more unemployed people around you, you're less unhappy about being unemployed because you have more buddies to play backgammon with, there's less stigma, a lot of things, but this is a finding that holds around the world. So we can answer questions like these, and we don't ask people, are you made unhappy by being unemployed, or are you, made, we have a happiness question first in the survey, right? Generally speaking, how happy are you with your life? I'll go into more of the other questions we use. And then we have data on people, their age, their income, their gender, their employment status, urban, rural, absolutely everything you can imagine. We control for all those things, and then we look at whether they're unemployed or not, or whether they smoke or not, or whether there are different taxes on smoking or not, and so that you don't, it's a very robust way of doing this. We don't ask leading questions about, do these things matter to your welfare? And so the method is particularly well suited for questions that revealed preferences don't answer very well. So revealed preferences in standard economics works well for a lot of questions, and why, you don't want to toss all that out, but there are a lot of questions that it doesn't answer as well. I focus on two in my work. The first is situations where people don't have the agency to make choices, or when consumption decisions are not the result of optimal choices, right? Smoking is an example of the latter. So here's some examples. Think about the welfare effects of macro and institutional arrangements individuals are powerless to change, such as macroeconomic volatility or inequality. I like to use the example of a poor peasant in Bolivia who's made unhappy by inequality, or happy by inequality. We don't know, right? We really have no way of knowing, because short of emigrating or protesting, the poor peasant has no way to reveal a preference in terms of inequality or macroeconomic stability, right, or instability. So you can look at the well-being effects of the inflation or the unemployment rate, or how much, how volatile the economic situation is, all kinds of stuff. The second set of questions that I look at are behaviors that are driven not by optimal choices, but by norms, addiction, or self-control problems. So think about lack of choice by the poor due to strong norms or low expectations. Think about somebody from a lower caste in India who's very poor, who doesn't choose, but just doesn't send their child to school. Was that really a choice? They're probably not sending their child to school because they're in a lower caste and their child's going to be a lower caste. There's no option otherwise. The schools aren't very good, the schools are awful, and they may even be dangerous. So is that really a choice, or is that just some awful sort of normative and institutional structure that could be making these people very unhappy? But we cannot look at their revealed preference and infer some sort of welfare outcome. The other is when you've got behaviors that are driven by addiction or self-control problems. We find, for example, that the obese are much less happy than the non-obese. Well, if they're consuming because it's an optimal choice that's enhancing their welfare, there's something wrong there. The smoking finding I just referred to, and then there are a number of other public health challenges. So we use these metrics to get at questions that we weren't able to get at are not able to get at with revealed preferences. So I mentioned the issue of this definitional issue. So in this Pursuit of Happiness book, I talk a lot about, well, how do we go from all this research we've done to we're being thrown into the policy realm, whether we like it or not. The metrics are going there, the findings are going there, the discussions are going there. We need to go beyond just happiness as a research question, when it was just a question basically on the left-hand side of an econometric equation, generally speaking, how happy are you with your life? And we had these findings about all these lovely, what are the determinants of happiness, and even what does happiness cause is something I've been working on. We weren't that worried about the definition of the well-being question, but when we start talking about using the metrics to evaluate policy, or even is well-being, is it an objective of policy? Is it a reasonable objective for policy? Then the definition matters a lot. So the most important questions that we haven't really answered yet, in my view, are what definition of happiness is most relevant and appropriate for policy? How does that definition vary across societies? And how do people's capabilities or agency mediate the dimension of well-being that they think of when they answer surveys? I mentioned that with the Afghanistan example. I actually have my own answers to all these questions, but I want to walk you through the findings and the definitions, because these are really normative questions, and people could have very different views about what the answers should be. So just a couple words on terminology. Early on in the literature, in particular by economists, the terms happiness, well-being, and subjective well-being, and life satisfaction were used interchangeably. Psychologists always took much more care to distinguish between those, and now economists are having to follow the psychologists because we're realizing that these differences matter a lot. So happiness is the most open-ended and least well-defined of the terms, although it's the one that gets the most public attention. The reason happiness is in the title of all my books is quite simple. It sells more books to have happiness in the title than if you use life satisfaction or hedonic well-being or some other, noinky term, right? So it's also the term that's in the Declaration of Independence, although the Declaration of Independence talks about the pursuit of happiness, not guaranteeing people happiness. And that distinction is going to wrap back around several times in this lecture. The happiness in general question just aims to gauge how happy people feel about their life in general. Generally speaking, how happy are you with your life? And the questions can be on a 10-point scale or a 4-point scale or a 5-point scale, going from very unhappy to very happy. And from an empirical research perspective, it really works for cross-country comparisons because you don't impose any definition of happiness on the respondent. And so we find that what makes people happy in China, Chile, Afghanistan, and in the US is basically the same because everybody's defining happiness how they want it, and we're not imposing a definition. Life satisfaction is pretty close to happiness. It correlates very closely with happiness. It's slightly more framed. If somebody says to you, generally speaking, how happy are you with your life as a whole? How satisfied are you with your life as a whole? It imposes a little more, my life as a whole, how satisfied am I with my life? You think more about your whole life than just, And so it turns out that life satisfaction, not surprisingly, then correlates a little more closely with income than happiness in general, because people with more income have more choices to do what they want to do in their life. Then there's a question that's in the Gallup World Poll, so it's actually overused by economists like me that use the Gallup World Poll a lot, which is used interchangeably with happiness, but it's quite distinct, and it asks respondents to compare their lives to the best possible life they can imagine. That introduces a relative component. If you ask somebody in Togo or Afghanistan, how does your life compare to the best possible life? That's very different from asking them, how happy are you in general, right? All of a sudden you go, my life, the best possible life. So people in Togo know they're far away from it, and people in the US or Sweden know they're a lot closer to that, and that affects the answers. So we find that responses to this ladder of life question correlate most closely with income than any of the well-being questions, both within countries, across individuals, within countries, and across countries. All of those questions, happiness, life satisfaction, and ladder of life question, those are all what we call evaluative well-being questions. They're about how people evaluate their lives as a whole. And that's one distinct dimension of well-being. The other distinct dimension of well-being is what we call experienced or hedonic well-being, which is really about how people experience their daily lives, how they feel as they go through different activities in their lives. So it measures people's moods, positive or negative, as they do different things in the day. And whether it's commuting to work, spending time with friends or family, conducting research or writing, or sitting in a boring lecture. So, and here psychologists are very adamant about distinguishing, and some of my own recent research is actually showing that this is true, that you can't, even though life satisfaction or happiness are sort of a continuum, you go from very unhappy to very happy, that these positive and negative affect questions, smiling yesterday, worrying yesterday, stress yesterday, anger yesterday, are quite distinct. And while most people who smiled a lot yesterday are also happier and less likely to be stressed, you can also have people that are both have a lot of positive affect, lots of smiling yesterday, and that also experience lots of anger and stress. And some of the progress paradoxes that I will talk about demonstrate this as well. And then the term subjective well-being is basically encompassing this whole area of reported well-being, as Dan mentioned in his introduction, listening to what people say, rather than what they reveal in a consumption choice. Okay, so just some of the basic findings from the literature. This is what really got people's attention early on with the work on the economics of happiness was something called the Easterlin paradox. And Richard Easterlin, who was one of these early crazy outliers, that's a wonderful professor of economics, was certainly very kind to me when I started working on all this stuff. But he discovered this when he started looking at happiness data in the mid-70s, which was as countries grew wealthier over time, average happiness levels didn't increase. So Japan quintupled its income in 3 decades, and average happiness levels actually fell. The US had compared to all the other OECD countries, up until 2001, had the most rapid growth of any OECD countries, and average happiness levels stayed flat. And it went on and on. And then if you looked across countries at any point in time, in what we call a cross-section in economics, there was some difference between poor and rich countries, but there wasn't a linear relationship between average per capita levels of income and average happiness. So if you look at this chart, which is our own recreation, here we have GDP per capita adjusted in constant dollars. And here we have percent of respondents per country above neutral on life satisfaction. If you were in an economics seminar, we could spend the whole rest of whatever amount of time we have left arguing about whether there was an Easterlin paradox based on this graph or not. And they would go at it, believe me. Because if you look at this, rich countries are clearly, on average, happier than the poor countries. On average, right? So then you say there's no Easterlin paradox. Yet, if you look among the rich countries, there's no clear pattern, right, between per capita income and well-being. And if you look at the poor countries, it's even more of a mess. I mean, they're all over the map. So what is going on? Well, first of all, per capita GDP captures, there are a lot of, because these are averages, this is very imprecise, first of all. Per capita GDP is capturing a lot of things that matter a lot to well-being that have nothing to do with money, but certainly having more money allows you to have more of them. Better public goods, better environment, more freedom. Most of these countries are democracies. And whatever you say about differences among these wealthy countries, the differences among them in terms of these things are not that great. Versus if you go to the developing countries, in a world where technology has brought things like better health and other things to countries that are much poorer than they used to be when they got them, there's a lot of variance. There's also a lot of variance in terms of democratic freedom. So if you look at these countries, most of the countries up here, most but not all, are democracies. They have reasonable public goods. They're reasonably good places to live. If you look at the very unhappy countries, Belarus, Pakistan, Iraq, Zimbabwe, go figure. Not much freedom, lots of violence, lots of things that are terrible for well-being. So that's in part why there's more variance. But then also, as I mentioned, these things are very imprecise. So when you just do these country-level averages, which is always what gets attention in the press, everybody wants to know if their country is happier than the other country. When I did the first study of happiness in Latin America, it was all over the newspapers there. Chileans are happier than Peruvians. And then the Colombians had this big, huge front page article. We're not the least happy country on the continent. It's like everyone wants to know where their country is. But a lot of it is just sort of bias in the data that you're not controlling for. And one of them is just cultural difference in the way people answer surveys. The Latin Americans in general are pretty high. Latin America is a good place to live, but people are also kind of cheerful. So that gets picked up in the average responses. If you look here, the French are much less happy than their income levels would predict. Well, my grandmother was from Paris, and you don't run into a coffee shop in Paris and say, "Have a nice day." You're not supposed to do that. You have to be, whatever. And then, I had a British friend that got tired of being told to have a nice day when she went to places in the US that she said, "Thank you, I have other plans." But the point is that there are just cultural differences in the way people even say good morning, right? And those get picked up by this as well. So anyway, but back to the bottom line story, it's clear that income and well-being across countries are somewhat correlated, but it's a very messy story. Where we really are much more robust in terms of the science is when we look at individuals, because then we are comparing hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of individuals in these huge data sets, and we can control for what country they live in, among other things, so we get rid of this cultural bias. So now I'm going to turn to the slide that's going to make Dan happy, maybe the only one the whole night, but this is the famous U-shape and age. This is data for Latin America. On the horizontal axis is years of age, and on the vertical one is level of happiness. This is Latin America data, but I've confirmed this U everywhere from most recently Mongolia, Afghanistan, Europe, US, Russia, everywhere. So what happens here? This is controlling for health and for being in a stable partnership. The relationship between age and happiness is clearly U-shaped, and what we've got is we have a turning point. For Latin America, it's about 48 years, and so I'm on my way up now, so that's a good thing, particularly since I have a birthday coming up. But for the US and Europe, it's about 44, not that far off. So it's usually around that point. For Russia, it's about 50, quite late, and that's about life expectancy for Russian males, so that's not a happy story. But what's going on? Why this is a regularity across sort of humankind. So what is it? Well, first of all, there's a kind of learning to be when you grow up effect. Now, your 20s and 30s may not be it. There's sort of a point where aspirations align with realities, and if by 44, 47 you haven't figured that out, you probably should. There's also the kind of middle-aged squeeze years where people often have dependent children, dependent parents, a lot of financial. There's a lot of stress around these years, and that shows up. And then a lot of it has to do with aging. People actually, as they age, psychologists show, need less extreme events to make them happy. They actually just get more appreciative of life. Then there are a couple of other things. There's a selection bias. Happier people live longer, so the least happy people are dying off as you go further up the age curve. And then finally, our oldest respondent for this Latin America sample was 99. There could be a senility effect, but I'll leave that to you. Okay, so besides age, what do we know is consistent about happiness around the world? Well, income does matter. Within countries, wealthier people are, without a doubt, on average, happier than poor people. After a certain amount of money, more and more money doesn't buy you more and more happiness, but it definitely matters. Health is even more important than income. The coefficients on health in these equations are much stronger than the coefficients on income. Employment matters a great deal. Anywhere we study it, people who are unemployed, who would like to be employed or in the labor force, are much less happy than others. And in fact, this is quite important if you want to think about policy relevance. People seem to adapt to a lot of things and return to their average levels of well-being, divorce, all kinds of stuff, illness, injuries. Long-term unemployment is something that we find that people never seem to fully adapt back from. Friendships matter a great deal. We don't really know the direction of causality. So, social people are more likely to be happy, but happier people are more likely to have friends. So it's a little bit circular. Same goes with marriage. Everybody always says that, there's a consistent finding where marriage or stable partnerships are associated with positive levels of well-being, but there's a selection effect because we're just looking at cross-section data, right? We're just looking at people at any moment. So happier people are more likely to marry each other. When you have over time data, we find, in fact, that the actual effect of getting married lasts about a year, and then you're just looking at the pre-marriage happiness levels of these two attached people. And I have a good colleague and friend in France who just published a paper about a year ago called "You Can't Be Happier Than Your Wife." It turns out, this is with overtime data, but the probability of divorce is highest when you have asymmetries in happiness levels. So you have an unhappy person married to a happy person. It's better to have two happy people together, two unhappy people together. You don't want asymmetries. But anyway, so some of these things, the direction of causality is a little hard to tease out. But anyway, because of these consistent patterns, we can control for all these things in these then we can look at the effects of things that vary, like commuting time, environmental quality, inflation or unemployment rate, and these other things I've talked about. So to some extent, we can study everything. The world is our oyster. But there are some complicating factors, and here's what I started off talking about. So one is why the definition of happiness matters when we just go beyond research. And when we were just using happiness and from a research perspective, that worked very well. But as I mentioned, from a policy perspective, it really does matter. Are we thinking about happiness in the daily contentment sense? Are we thinking about happiness as the best possible ladder question, this relative question? Are we thinking about life satisfaction? there's a chapter in my book called Should Bentham or Aristotle Be in the Statistics Office? So we have broad agreement on 2 dimensions of well-being, each of which could have implications for policy. So Jeremy Bentham's concept of well-being was maximizing the contentment and pleasure of the greatest number of individuals as they experience their lives. So that was people feeling happy at the moment on a day-to-day basis. And this falls under the general rubric of experience well-being, hedonic well-being. How worried or happy or were you as you just go through your daily life? Aristotle, on the other hand, thought of happiness as eudaimonia, which is a Greek word that combines 2 concepts, eu meaning well-being or abundance, and daimon meaning the power controlling an individual's destiny. So your ability to control your life, to have a meaningful life. And this falls under the rubric of evaluative well-being. And I think it implicitly includes the opportunity to lead a purposeful or fulfilling life. I think that's when Jefferson talked about the pursuit of happiness, I think that's the dimension of happiness that he was writing about or thinking about. So hedonic well-being measures are better for assessing quality of life and life at the moment, and evaluative well-being measures are better for assessing people's capacity to make choices and to seek fulfilling lives. So which dimension matters to a particular person in part is determined by his or her capacity to pursue a meaningful life. So lacking capacity, for example, due to lack of wealth or low expectations or strongly imposed norms. I talked about somebody in a lower caste who's stuck in a lower caste forever. People may place more value on simple day-to-day experiences because that's what they can do, things like friendship and religion. And those with more capacity may have less time and interest in day-to-day experience, particularly if they're very focused on some overarching objective or achievement. Think about graduate students. Sometimes finishing a PhD is a slog, but there's an objective on the other end. There's a fulfillment to it, so that you sacrifice a lot of things in the moment for some sort of bigger life objective. But that's a choice that you've made because you have the ability to do that. If you don't have, absent that choice, you may not emphasize that dimension of well-being as much. So we have some data that supports this. Kahneman and Deaton published an article showing that income and evaluative well-being, right, this life satisfaction kind of well-being, the Aristotelian kind of well-being, correlate all the way up the income ladder. So the more money you have, the higher your levels of evaluative well-being are because you have more choices, ability to make choices in your life, versus the relationship between income and experience well-being, smiling yesterday, tapers off at median levels of income in the United States. So not having enough money is terrible for everything, your experiences, your moods. But after you have enough, more money is not going to make you smile anymore in a day. It's not going to make you enjoy your commute more. It just is what it is. We find the same in Latin America, where we find that the most important variables to the well-being of the poor, these are rough categories, after having enough food to eat, are their friends and family they can rely on at times of need. The most important variables to the rich, again, rough category, above median income, after having enough food to eat, are work and health. So you could conclude that the rich are greedy jerks and they don't care about their friends and family. But really looking at it a little more closely, friends and family are the safety net that the poor have in absence of other alternatives. And for the rich, work and health are their agency. It's what allows them to have choices in life. Just quickly, I don't want to go too into detail on these religion findings. I'm happy to talk about them in the questions, but I want to leave time for questions and not go on too long. But we do find that people with less means and agency emphasize religion more in their life, both within countries and around the world. So what about this adaptation issue? So adaptations are psychological defense mechanisms, right? They're positive ones like sublimation and humor, and they're negative ones like paranoia. But it's a way to preserve your psychological well-being. So those people with limited means may actually emphasize the daily experience kind of well-being simply because it's a way to, that's, if you live in Afghanistan and you really don't have many choices, just enjoying your daily life to the extent you can is, in a way, an adaptation. It's a way to preserve your well-being. So I think it's sort of in the face of adverse conditions, and if you have low expectations, just enjoying daily life, maybe being religious, maybe, enjoying your friends and family. It's not to say other people don't enjoy those things, but if that's your sole emphasis, it may be because that's what you can do. So you adapt. That may be good from an individual perspective, but if you think about this, a lot of people, because they have no choice, simply adapting and making the best of things, that may result in collective tolerance for poor equilibrium. I think it helps explain why some countries seem to be stuck in these bad patterns, and you'd think, why doesn't everybody go on the streets and protest? And they don't. And we find a lot of evidence of adaptation to high levels of crime and corruption or poor norms of health. People in Guatemala, for example, are report to be more satisfied with their health than people in Chile, even though health standards in Guatemala are like sub-Saharan Africa, and health standards in Chile are among the highest in the OECD. So there's something going on there, right? So my research shows that people are much better able to adapt to unpleasant certainty, poverty, high levels of crime and corruption, than they are to uncertainty. So pain and anxiety are harder to adapt to because they're uncertain. You can't adapt to them. Rapid or volatile economic growth or changes in things like crime and corruption rates. And people can have very different norms of what, even that, I think about this, that a lot has to do with what you expect. So I'll give you an example from my own life. I was born and grew up in Peru, but I've worked and lived in the US as much of my life, right? Well, about 10 years ago, I came out of my house in northwest DC and was busy waving at my baby twins, not looking at my car. I got in the car and tried to drive off. It started, but it wouldn't go anywhere. It was late, had to go, probably give a talk somewhere. Got out, slammed the door, what's wrong with this damn thing? And my car was on blocks, and the tires had been stolen. And, I was outraged. The police came. This never happened in northwest DC. Why me? I was I absolutely just complete mess of a day, right? If the same thing had happened to me in Lima, the city where I grew up, my reaction would have been totally different. It would have been like, you idiot, you left the car out on this street. You knew the tires would get stolen, right? Same person, completely different expectations about what norms of crime should be. So a lot of this adaptation thing is in people's expectations. But we really do find that unpleasant certainty, for some reason, including like mobility injuries, are much easier for people to adapt to than uncertainty. So I'll give you, this is a great example. This is from the Gallup World Poll, daily poll in the US. So it's 1,000 Americans a day, nationally representative sample, during the economic crisis. So it's not the same 1,000 people, but they're similar people every day. The red line is our average happiness levels for the United States, and the scale for that, this is the best possible life question, is on the right, and the blue line is the Dow Jones, and the scale for that is on the left. January 2008 through January 2010, basically the financial crisis. So what happens when this starts, roughly when Lehman collapsed and the bottom fell out of the markets, average well-being levels fall absolutely dramatically. Just to give you an example, over 3 decades of very rapid growth, average well-being levels for the U.S. were flat. It didn't change at all or by a minuscule point. This is an 11% drop in 6 months. It's absolutely dramatic. You get a couple of spikes. One is Obama's inauguration, and the other is Valentine's Day. But for the most part, call those outliers. You get this pattern where all of a sudden the bottom stops falling out of the markets, right? I don't know how many of you all remember this period, but there was a point where everybody was like, how far will it go? Will I lose my house? Will I lose my retirement income? What is going to happen? And that period was deleterious for well-being. You can't adapt to something that you don't know what it is, if it's still changing, right? Then the markets sort of slowly sputter up. Nothing too dramatic here. Average happiness levels not only go up, but they go up higher than they were before. This is not a Pollyanna effect. The same people say their economic situation is worse than it was before, but they can cope with that. It's a certain loss. Okay, now I can move on. So I can adapt to that and move on. So I think it's a good example of how uncertainty is much worse than unpleasant certainty. So related to that is something that I call happy levels versus unhappy changes in the development process. I think it helps explain a lot of progress paradoxes. For example, my initial findings that I was talking about when we got these upwardly mobile people that reported to be very unhappy. We know that people are, on average, happier in countries with higher levels of GDP per capita. But we get these funny findings, like my happy peasants and frustrated achievers that I talked about. Find migrants whose income has quintupled since they left wherever they left from, are less happy than non-migrants in their countries of destination. At the macro level, we get something called the paradox of unhappy growth, where, and I won't get into the technicalities of this, but basically, we find that controlling for GDP levels per capita, so these come in positive, right? If you live in a country that has a higher level of GDP per capita, on average, you're happier. But controlling for those, economic growth, which is supposed to be the be and end all of economics, right, was negatively correlated with life satisfaction, standard of living, and health satisfaction. Now, this is from Gallup World Poll data. It's countries around the world. We tried to understand this and what was driving it, so we broke up into countries above and below median rates of growth and above and below median levels of income for the world. And this finding is not driven by Mali getting out of poverty or by the US scoring 2.3 versus 2.4%. It's driven by Brazil, China, these rapidly growing middle-income countries, growth of 10%, 14%. Growth at those rates is very uncertain and very unsettling. And you may be doing well, the person next to you is doing better. Your education worked a year ago, and all of a sudden it isn't marketable in new industries or whatever it might be. And so we find, and this is right now China is the government, lots of regional governments in China come talk to me all the time. They're petrified. Why is everybody so unhappy? We're growing at 8%. What's going on? Well, the paradox of unhappy growth. And here is where I talk about changes versus levels, right? The period, I bet in 5 years, if growth probably will slow down and things will stabilize, and you'll probably see an uptick in well-being. But this period of change is typically a very unhappy one. And I think it also speaks to the fact that some uncertainty is often necessary to achieve progress. And so it highlights why some societies blow up when you don't expect them to because they're growing fast, and then you've got, in the Arab Spring, countries were growing rapidly. People were worried about their future opportunities, but there wasn't a low economic growth problem. In the protests around the world in recent years, we've been looking at the characteristics of the protesters in Chile, Brazil, Turkey, Russia. These are not poor, low-growing economies. They're rapidly growing middle-income countries. The protesters aren't poor either. They're middle-income, middle-age. So it suggests that, what drives progress and how progress and change affects people is more complicated than our standard economic assumptions suggest. So, and one of the big questions that comes out of that for me is maybe it isn't that the change causes unhappiness, but you needed unhappiness to drive change. So we've been doing work on the channels of causality and these different dimensions of well-being, and looking at do different dimensions of well-being cause different outcomes, and maybe it isn't that change causes unhappiness, but unhappiness causes change. So we've got this great data on intent to migrate from Latin America now in the Gallup World Poll, where we're able to look at the well-being levels of migrants before they leave their country, right, before they go. Turns out the characteristics of migrants that intend to leave at least South America are, for the most part, more educated, wealthier, but less happy than the average. They are classic frustrated achievers, right? And we're trying to see what happens when they get to where they were before. But it suggests that there may be a kind of unhappiness driving change effect. Same goes with the Arab Spring. We're trying now to match the post-Arab Spring well-being data with the pre-Arab Spring one, where we definitely found that there were high levels of economic growth, but more frustration in the Arab Spring rebellion countries than in similar countries that didn't have rebellions. And then we're also looking at these different dimensions of well-being and longer-term behaviors. For example, contentment, happiness in the contentment sense versus happiness in the life evaluation sense. We find people that are simply more satisfied with their jobs, right? So I'm content with my job, are no more productive than the average. But people who report to do meaningful work every day or to be appreciated at work are much more productive than the average. Direction of causality issues there, which I won't go into. But anyway, a whole bunch of work trying to tease out whether maybe the progress paradox might run in the other direction. And then the last thing we've been doing that's a lot of fun is, one of the things we find is that a lot of well-being is unexplained. Even though we have all these fancy equations controlling for everything that you possibly could think of controlling for, it turns out that a lot of what explains it all is just people's innate character traits. And they're basically a bell curve. So that there's a big average in the middle, but there are very naturally curmudgeonly people and naturally very happy people, and you all know both kinds, right? And it turns out that where in the well-being distribution you are can also have an effect on how you behave in the labor market and other things. On average, happier people perform better in the labor market, on average, and they're healthier. But it turns out if you're on a 9-point scale, if you're a nine, you don't earn more money than the average. You earn less. You have more friends and things, but you don't work harder than the average. And when we've been looking at what do the happiest respondents value the most, it turns out they value income and employment and full-time employment the least. They like part-time employment, but learning and creativity are very important to the happiest people. So we've been teasing this out also because I want to know about the unhappiest people and propensity to protest and everything else. But it turns out that a lot of this is really about how people's character traits interact with their environment and determine certain outcomes. And some of you may remember there was a lot of debate about genes versus the environment, determining, was it nature versus nurture determining people's IQ? It turns out it's very clearly an interaction. It's kind of what you're endowed with and how that interacts. With well-being, it's very similar, and we're really trying to understand how that affects different kinds of behaviors. Everything from propensity to protest to effort in the labor market to voting behavior, you name it. Okay, so just really quickly, I wanted to say a couple of words on policy and then open it up. So there are obviously still a lot of unanswered questions, and they're quite relevant to how we think about these things in the policy realm. But I think it's a very easy first step to just start collecting the data systematically. And in the official realm, because it's very different when you have data that's private or in academic hands versus data that's just part of how people, when people hear about the unemployment rate in 10 years, if they start hearing about changes in well-being levels of a certain percentage, that's going to start to mean something in a way that it doesn't mean anything now, and the numbers wouldn't mean anything yet because we don't know it. We haven't seen the data enough times in the public domain. The British have already started collecting 5 well-being questions in their statistics, and this is also what the OECD is recommending. One is, generally speaking, how satisfied are you with your life? That's that evaluative life satisfaction. Happiness in relative terms, the ladder of life question. Happiness, life as experienced on a daily basis with one positive question. How often did you smile yesterday, or how happy were you yesterday? And then one negative question. How often did you worry yesterday, or how anxious were you yesterday? It turns out worry and anxiety are very similar questions, but anger is another question that we have some data on, but that is very different from sort of just plain negative affect. And again, anger may be a question if you're particularly interested in things like civil violence or public protests that you need to study differently. Again, if we had these questions in our statistics, it would be easier to do that. And then finally, happiness in the Aristotelian sense. So the British asked people, how do you have meaning or purpose in your life, or something like that, with a scale that's escaping me, but that captures it quite distinctly. And one of the things this would do, I think, among others, is that we get a handle on, happiness as contentment versus happiness in the opportunity sense. And, different societies value, quality of life more than achievement, some more than others. Different people value those things more than others. You'd certainly be able to measure that. And then also understand why some people may not be happy in the day-to-day sense, but very driven, why some people maybe adapt to poor circumstances and are content, but have no opportunities. And if we are a society that promises the pursuit of happiness and life fulfillment, and we are now as a society very worried about social mobility and unequal opportunities, I think understanding the well-being dimensions to that could really help us understand some of what's going on. Okay, and just the couple of concluding thoughts. Happiness is in the end a much more complicated concept than is income, right? We know what income's measuring, but income is limited in terms of what it's telling us about human well-being. But right now we can compare income with complete clarity as to what it seems to measure across people, or almost complete clarity. Happiness in it, though, has a lot of things that we still need to resolve. One is the definitional issues. We're getting a good handle on those in terms of what questions measure what, but we still need to get a normative handle on what we think is appropriate in the policy dimension, or what different publics would think would be appropriate in the policy dimension. There are a couple of other things. One is cardinality versus ordinality. So when we ask these questions, they're on ordinal scales with no cardinal weight. So, 1 is unhappy, very unhappy, and 4 is very happy. But 4 is not 4 more times than 1 in our data or in our equations or in our metrics or on the scales. So, but from a societal perspective, one would think you might value moving people up from misery into just kind of average than moving somebody who is already happy to be very happy. Again, that's a normative issue, but if you're going to talk policy, you need to have some handle on that question. In the same way, and how much of a handle, how much do you focus on the miserable, right? Do you only focus on the miserable? Macroeconomic policy places some focus on getting people out of poverty, but it also focuses on raising aggregate levels up. Right? And I would think well-being policy would have to find a balance like that. Another issue is intertemporal. Today's well-being versus the future well-being or well-being of children. The same policies may not enhance both. They're intertemporal choices. I mentioned this. What's a meaningful change in well-being? Do we know? How do we translate this for the public? I think we know what one is. Moving somebody over the misery threshold is meaningful. We know what is a significant movement on the happiness scale. But that's very different from the public understanding that. You tell somebody, well, average levels of happiness in the UK were on a 10-point scale, were 6.9 last year, and they're 7.1 this year. Big deal. It is actually a significant movement, but if you don't know what the scale is, you don't know what it implies. So again, some of that is just public, the data being in the public domain for a while. Some of it is scholars like me involved in this explaining what those movements mean better. And then, which metrics should be in policy? Our National Academies panel actually was asked to focus on these hedonic metrics, the daily experience metrics. A lot of governments are already collecting life satisfaction. This life fulfillment dimension, in my view, is probably the most relevant for policy, but do the daily metrics even matter? Do we care about daily quality of life? Well, I certainly think we do. There are a lot of areas like end-of-life care where quality of life is probably the objective that you care about, right? And we need to be able to measure it. But it also turns out, from a kind of longer-term point of view, that daily experience can undermine longer-term objectives. So Alan Kruger has a new study showing that looking at unemployed people during job searches and finding that the time spent looking for a job was the least happy time of the day. The rest of the day, they were actually not really less happy than anybody else. But this job search time was incredibly sad, as measured by sadness, actually. And the longer people spent in that time, the more likely they were to give up the job search. So, if daily experience is negative enough, people give up. So there are also some findings from George Akerlof looking at kids in gangs who were given scholarships to fancy scholarships like Exeter and Andover. Well, so it turns out they were very capable intellectually, but they got to these places and they didn't fit in, and they were very unhappy on a daily basis, so much so that they dropped out. They gave up the opportunity. Then they came back to their gangs and they didn't fit in there either. So here's one, example. If you don't think through about what people's experience is going to be like when you intervene, you really could mess things up big time. So I think we do need to think about how these two different dimensions interact with each other and how short-term daily experience can have really long-term effects on people's ability to seek fulfilling lives. Anyway, I personally think that this idea of giving people more choices and capacity to lead fulfilling lives is more directly relevant if we're to think about well-being as a policy objective, but I think we certainly need to measure both kinds of well-being as inputs into policy monitoring, assessment, and as complements to GNP data. I certainly am far from thinking we should ever think about replacing GNP or income data. I think the most important things that these data tell us is where there are differences between what the well-being metrics tell us on the one hand, what the income metrics tell us on the other, and where the discrepancies are is telling us something really important about human well-being that we should be exploring more. So I hope I haven't gone on too long. I'll stop and happy to answer some questions.
I really appreciate that.
I appreciate that you've brought in different ways of thinking about well-being. And I liked how you nuanced the impact of kind of agency on that. But all of the views of well-being that you presented, from my mind, all presuppose individualism. So any notion of well-being is in part a view of a being, or the self at stake, and a view of the wellness. And so in all of those definitions, they're presupposing a kind of individualistic sense of self based on a kind of masterful, bounded self that emphasizes control and sees the good largely in terms of emotional satisfaction or pursuing one's self-chosen goals or meanings in life. And I worry that this has the tendency to potentially pathologize those outside of the Western tradition and also insulate the Western tradition from learning about views of well-being that emphasize very different things, like the importance of the collective or the idea of spiritual surrender or alignment with the divine plan or something of that nature. When you talked about that, it was in the context of those who weren't sort of wealthy enough or sounded like financially successful enough that they had to adapt, as opposed to my sense of other cultures is that that goal of relinquishing sort of the ego or the bounded masterful self is actually seen as an important part of growth and development, and it's the sort of more Western individualistic sense of self in many traditions is seen as the source of suffering.
Well, they're very good points, but I think it's attributing a lot to the metrics in the sense that basically what we're doing is just measuring, right? And so many of the things we find suggest that beyond self is incredibly important. Religious people are happier than non-religious people. People with friends are happier than without friends. People with good social capital around them are happier than people without good social capital. People in democracies are happier than people without freedom. So there's a lot suggesting that the collective good, the collective environment matters a lot, just in the data. But it's really important to think about these data as bottom-up data where we're listening to what people say. We're not, and taking the information that is therein. And so in some levels, they're the most democratic data there are, right? So if you find that people in Bhutan, for example, place more, where I've been, would place more time on the collective self than people in the US, which surely they do, that would just show up in the data. And it will tell you that, in a well-being regression on the Bhutanese versus the Americans, the Bhutanese, the coefficient on any kind of collective measure and spirituality and all these other things is going to be much higher than it would be in the US. So you're not imposing anything on the Bhutanese or on Americans, right? There are also there are differences in terms of not just the collective, but some societies really value quality of life more than achievement and pursuing endless pursuit of opportunity. France versus the US is an example. Or, just different cultures kind of value sort of quiet time versus other cultures value, more extreme experiences. Why are we all still going down double black diamonds in Stowe at age 50? I'm sure there's some cultures that think we're absolutely cuckoo. So, but the data aren't imposing, the data are just simply showing us how those different things matter to people's well-being, and we can assess that in relative terms based on what people say.
Well, I think that's true, and yet that way of approaching well-being is already presupposing a particular orientation that we tend not to recognize. And so we, I think collectively, haven't gone into these other areas and say, how would you think about well-being? What would be your own cultural perspective on what that means? Because even when we ask people about life satisfaction or affect balance, there's lots of presuppositions in those measures and in the theory that's behind it that really is historically peculiar. And maybe we could talk more about that later. But
yeah, I'm just wondering what you think we should be asking.
Well, I think we need to kind of go in more in terms of doing ethnography and field work and seeing, well, what would be the indigenous metrics in other parts of the world? Because the risk is that we pathologize other people by not seeing their indigenous virtues and their indigenous understandings of the self, but that we also don't benefit and learn from those other traditions. Perhaps one example would be the impact that mindfulness is having in Western cultures. So this has become a huge epidemic in the mental health fields, but it's sort of the first time that a non-Western understanding of well-being that is based on sort of acceptance and working with one's ego or self in a different way is entering into sort of mainstream America and arguably challenging this more individualistic sense of self that's based on environmental mastery and control and emotional gratification and satisfaction.
Yeah, I think, and I've done a lot of in-depth level field work in studying poverty and coping strategies of the poor in different cultures, and learned tremendously from it. And I think there's always this interaction between kind of in-depth, single culture kind of research and where you're trying to do large ends and be as scientifically robust as possible in developing metrics. And I think this exercise is of the latter nature. I think much more than a lot of large-scale data collections, the science is all about understanding that there are different dimensions. Even trying to measure eudaimonic well-being from the sense of meaning or purpose in life, which is one area we know the least about, but where there's some really good experimental work going on. My colleague Paul Dolan at LSE, who's one of the main advisors to the British government. And we do find that the eudaimonic metrics track less, they're a little bit less obvious, the findings, than, say, the ones on just life satisfaction or positive or negative affect. So we're trying to introduce, as complex dimensions of well-being as you can while still being, statistically tractable. That doesn't mean, if you go through the literature, there are I can't keep up with the amount of publications in all kinds of fields going, looking at quality of life, among the Maasai Indians in Kenya or whatever it could be. So I think there are a lot of attempts to understand cultural differences. I'm not sure that those attempts are best made by changing the kind of baseline metrics as much as, looking across cultures with the same metrics. That's just from a kind of large N econometric point of view. It doesn't mean that other kind of work, ethnography and other things can't go forward. I just think it's a different exercise.
Have you noticed any trends in which countries have the... Have you noticed any trends in which countries have the greatest disparities in happiness levels?
That's a great question. There's inequality in happiness typically goes down as countries prosper more. So inequality in well-being is much lower in the Scandinavian countries, right, which have the highest levels of well-being and prosperity, than it is in, say, Latin America, where you get also a lot more inequality in prosperity, right? So it's almost what you would expect. The one country that trends differently is the US, where inequality and well-being has been increasing, as has inequality. But it is, of the wealthy countries, it stands out. The other set of countries where inequality in well-being is very high is the transition economies. Since the transition, huge increases also in inequality in income. That before they were income inequality was artificially low, and now it's in Russia, it's amongst the highest in the world and what it can be. But there it's also, the trends are very much explained by clear differences between winners and losers in the transition process. You can just identify the cohorts, education, whatever, that have participated in market prosperity and those that have been left behind. It matches with their attitudes, nostalgia for the pre-Soviet system, and then inequality and well-being levels also match that too. So it's something I don't think we've studied enough, but that it's on the table.
Oh, thank you. That was a very interesting presentation. I'm a faculty member in the environmental studies program, and I'm new at learning about the research that's been on happiness. And my question is kind of one coming from a position of wanting to learn more about this. Can you give us a sense of what kind of research is being done, and what does it seem to be saying about whether environmental quality causes happiness effects, or whether happiness has effects on environmental quality? Like, what's the relationship between the two? And I know I'm opening up another can of worms, because we could have a similar lecture about how we would define environmental quality. But I'm just kind of wondering, is there some research on the connection between those two? And if so, what is it saying?
Yeah, absolutely. And I almost opened up today talking about adaptation to temperature, because it turns out that there aren't really any well-being effects of living in a colder or warmer climate, because you basically adapt to whatever climate you live in, and there's some sort of selection bias, because people who really hate cold climates will move south, and people who really love snow will move north if they can. But weather matters. So, for example, if it were 60 degrees here tomorrow and sunny, you'd see a big boost in well-being just because of the change in weather. So I'm not trying to get around your question, I'm trying to get back to it. So it turns out with environmental quality, you kind of have this, I talked about changes versus levels effect. So basically people on average who live in places with better environmental quality, controlling for everything else, are slightly happier, right? So you can see there's a positive well-being effect, and there's kind of a green spaces sort of thing, another thing. But people also adapt to bad environmental quality in the same way that they adapt to other kinds of adversity. And so some of the airplane noise studies that have been done, there have been some on sort of happiness and airplane noise. It turns out there are some negative effects, but they're not as negative as you think they would be, because people who live around high levels of airplane noise adapt to it somewhat. So again, a bit like people adapting to poor norms of health, it may suggest why people who live with poor environmental quality don't do as much as you would think they would about it if you're more accustomed to better environmental quality. It's not a great answer, but it's a little bit of a complicated story.
I was just wondering about what conclusions shall we draw from these definitions and these studies in terms of designing an economy for well-being, because that was also part of the title in a way. And so that I can see the challenges, because these are subjective measures, of course. But if you can guide us a little bit in thinking in that way, thank you.
I think there are two clear directions, and they're distinct, but they complement each other. One is simply to start to collect the data in a systematic enough way that, again, you don't want to impose, you don't want to say this is what would make every society have higher levels of well-being. But if you collect enough overtime data on particular societies, you can compare across societies, but also look at any one society over time and look at changes. And if you find, as we already find very consistent patterns in the data, unemployment's terrible for well-being, poor health is terrible for well-being, lack of health insurance is something else, is bad for well-being. Time with family and friends is good for well-being. Democracy is good for well-being. Meaningful work is good for well-being. It suggests a certain emphasis to policy that may not be the current emphasis. That's kind of from the broader macro, what would be generally good for well-being if well-being is a policy objective. But the other thing is that the metrics are just particularly good for both, assessing, informing policy design along those same things. If you're trying to design a policy intervention, if you know what the potential well-being effects could be of a trade-off between inflation or unemployment or other things that will affect policy design. You can monitor policy. You measure well-being before, after, and during and after a policy intervention to get a sense of how did it affect well-being. It's another use. And then assessing policy outcomes in addition to whatever your objective might be in terms of enhancing environmental quality or reducing crime or whatever else. What did it do for well-being, if anything? And it gives you complementary metrics. And so I think when I think of an economy of well-being, I think of an economy that includes all the standard measures of economic progress, but also includes measures of well-being. And it gets a better sense of, are we emphasizing, the right things, not enough, or that kind of thing. But it's never in the sense of any sort of mandate or of saying, okay, let's toss out what we get from these metrics and replace them with these metrics. It's saying these metrics can tell us a lot. And again, as I said before, when the well-being metrics tell us one thing and income metrics tell us another, we need to understand what's the discrepancy there. There's one last one there, I guess. I don't know, is that...
I was really interested in this slide that you had talking about, people's expectations and how that can impact happiness. And I was wondering if there was a scenario where you had two people who had equally low incomes and other very similar lives. If one of them had, say, a very wealthy neighbor who had a nice house, could that drive that person's happiness below the other person's just by having this standard of comparison?
Absolutely, but you've asked a really good question because there are two different things going on. One is, there have been studies that show if you compare two people the same level of income and one lives in a wealthier neighborhood in the U.S., that their happiness is lower because of comparison effects. The same studies have sometimes been done in poorer contexts, and you get the opposite finding because of what we call signaling effects. So comparison effects are sort of, I'm made less happy because my neighbor's richer than me and I can't really do much to change it. But signaling effects are a little more about future expectations. So you move to another neighborhood or another country because you have expectations of bettering your future and you think you can. Then you may take the wealthier neighbor as a sign of where you might go next. If you never had the chance, if you had those expectations but you never could fulfill them, then you would be frustrated and unhappy. But we certainly find that people who have higher prospects of upward mobility, in other words, people who think they'll do better in the future, their children will do better in the future, are much happier than people that don't have high prospects for the future. It's also hard to tease out because happier people are more likely to have higher, be more positive in general. So expectations are good for well-being, but frustrated expectations are bad for well-being. Is probably the simpler answer to your question. Dan.
I'm going to wrap up, Carol, what I thought was a great presentation on a sort of naive question, but it follows a little bit on one of the earlier interventions. Tolstoy was said to have once remarked that he'd give it all up if he could just be a simple peasant. And I'm wondering if, I think you ran through this a bit, but education and happiness, obviously they correlate well because education correlates with income, but do you ever
Oh, yeah.
do it as an independent variable?
That's a great question. And it turns out education's very funny and all over the map, precisely because when you control for income, income picks up a lot of the positive effects. And then sometimes you find education is insignificant, sometimes it's still positive, sometimes you find it's negative. In the transition economies is a great place because there are a lot of people that are very educated that aren't doing what they were educated to do. And we find, for example, education, I think, is much less important to, when we do the happiest people, the education is kind of a little less important. Because once you control for the kind of income bonus that you get, there are a lot of people who are educated who aren't doing what they want to be doing. And then there's some people who are educated but are just very driven and kind of frustrated, and picks that up. And then lastly, there's something that actually Jay and I were working on. We were looking at the well-being of artists and people who participate in the arts. And there's sort of a positive well-being effect there. And there you almost get the reverse thing where they may have lower income levels than their education would predict, but their education may actually, if they're trained as artists, their education is positively correlated with their well-being. So education is all over the map.
Civilization is discontent goes on.
Yes. Can't help Tolstoy.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I thought this was a great presentation. I'm going to come join you so that everyone knows it's time that they can go. And anyway, so I'll join me in giving a round of applause.
Thank you.